Hello, I'm Rob Califf, and I want to welcome you to another one of our editions of the Life and Times of Famous Cardiologists. I'm here at the European Society of Cardiology in Stockholm having a great time, and I'm here with Professor Paul Hugenholtz, who I've gotten to know over the last 10 to 15 years. And
a little longer.
Yeah. And as an American, initially having no experience with Europe and then getting involved in clinical trials, as I started coming across the ocean, I learned there was this man who had a huge influence on the development of European cardiology, but not necessarily purely from a European perspective, with a bit of history in the Americas. And so I'm really privileged to have a conversation with Paul about your life and times and what you've experienced and things that other people can learn from what
It's my pleasure.
You've learned. Let's start at the beginning. When were you born?
I was born, and I was afraid you'd ask me this, on the 1st of April in 1928. So the April Fool's Day and all the consequences have been with me for a long, long time.
Fantastic. Now I understand some things.
But I've also learned to run somewhat thicker skin than others, and so I can handle it.
Good. And where were you born?
I was born in Wassenaar. It's a small town which is sort of the... being a long-time citizen of the state of Massachusetts, it's sort of like the Wellesley Weston of Boston, the decent part. My father was there a general practitioner, and he eventually thought that the problems of the world were not anymore, shall we say, the physical but the mental ones, and became a psychiatrist. And then after the war, we had Leiden next door, so that was the school we went to. And then in 1950, as I graduated, there was a general tendency in Europe, but certainly in Holland, go west, young man, and America beckoned. I'd made some trips around the world as a ship surgeon, and I decided I wanted to be in America. So then the training started wonderfully in Michigan. And from Michigan, the Air Force grabbed me. So I spent 2.5 years in Arizona in the desert, had my own ward, learned more medicine there than I think ever later in Boston.
So the Air Force grabbed you in the United States?
Sure, because I was a citizen by that time.
Okay, so but let's go back, because I think people's early lives have a huge influence on what they do later, and I've heard that many times interviewing people that have done great things. So hard for many of people of my generation to imagine Europe in 1928. Obviously that's when you were born, but leading up to World War II, what were things like as you were a child growing up? What are your memories of the general state of things?
Well, I certainly, being a doctor's son, had, with 3 of my brothers, had a more or less privileged part. But Holland was very rich in those days. The colonies were bringing in ample amounts of money, tea, coffee, you name it. And it was a conservative community. It was rather separated along religious lines, Catholics, Protestants. There was an up-and-coming social responsibility. And I found the community living between, shall we say, when I became aware of things, 1932 to 1940, a very pleasant period, very quiet, except for the fact that just across the border, it was very evident what was happening in Germany.
So how old were you when you first realized what was happening in Germany?
I hate to bring that up, but it was a huge cloud, like Nagasaki, Hiroshima, which was the burning of the city of Rotterdam. They bombed the whole stuff with incendiary bombs. Eventually, when I got back to Rotterdam, much later in this story, you can call it a blessing in disguise because we had to start from scratch. No. But that was terrible. To see that cloud, it was just...
So it's not important to anyone else, but I had not realized that Rotterdam actually had had such an attack. And I guess that explains why when you go to Rotterdam, it doesn't look all that old, because it was really built.
The Germans had first used mass bombing in Warsaw, and then in 1940, when the war went west, they had already done certain parts of that type of saturation bombing in England, but Rotterdam was to force us to capitulate the target, and that happened.
So you were living out in the countryside when you were 12 years old when that happened. What were you thinking?
Well, through the family, I knew what was threatening for 2 years, and I had myself been in various situations by serving the soldiers who were nearby, guarding an important place, and having a fighter shoot at us. So I still remember the bullets in the thing. So that for me it was in a way unexpected, and the other way totally unexpected event, but it totally changed our lives.
So then what happened when your country did capitulate, as it had to? It was overwhelmed at that point. What happened to you during that? 12 years old these days would be like right at the beginning of puberty. A lot of things are happening then.
Well, in a way, we got in a very peculiar situation. People stayed closer together. We had our dance lessons, we had our tennis lessons, we had this thing. And then in 1944 in the spring, I saw a squad car pull up in front. A couple of soldiers got out. I lived in a school with a lot of glass. You saw everything. And it was striking to me that these guys were straight inside, and I said, okay, I'll get up and I'll warn 2 or 3 of my friends in another class who couldn't have seen it, who were Jewish. And I said, I think this is something very bad. So we all went to the roof of the school. We thought we wouldn't be noticed. And before we knew it, there was someone in my class who had seen it and told the soldiers. So we ended up with a police officer, or rather it was German police, very erudite man. And he said, young man, what you've done is stupid. You know, we are more powerful than anybody else. I'll let you go. Just use your brain next time and don't get in my hands anymore. I don't know what I thought at the time. I was glad to be home. 6 months later, I was arrested in October 44 with another 400 young men who were at the central kitchen, where food was getting scarce, with a bucket, with a pea soup. And at that point, before we knew it, we started walking again towards the central place where we were going to be registered, presumably. We knew about transportations en masse in Germany, forced labor. We were 17, 18, so we had it figured out. And this is a wonderful story, I have to tell you. I'm not that religious, but I know the Bible. We were walking in our town, which I knew intimately. It was a small village. And the road, like a funnel, came narrower and narrower. And then we knew it would make a very sharp turn to the left, 270 degrees. And I said to Jan Verroot, my best friend, we're going to walk straight ahead. Meanwhile, there were lots of people around giving sweaters and handing out grapes and bread. You know how that goes under those circumstances. The hedge of people opened up, and it was like the Jews in the Red Sea.
You disappeared into the crowd.
Incredible. I thought I would be shot. Nothing happened. 5 days later, I was home again, etc. But it was such an experience. Yeah, and that, of course, yeah, in a way, for a doctor, tells you how relative things are.
Yeah, so some really important lessons there. Just briefly, your mother. So
Yeah.
your father was a practitioner. Your mother, what did she do?
Well, my mother was a very remarkable lady. I guess we all say this for our mothers, but she was, because she was the first female student in Rotterdam. Rotterdam being a little further away from our town. And she also ran the students' club for ladies in the membership 10. And she did economy. And I think that saved our lives during the war, because my father went in the underground in 1941. We never saw him anymore until after the war, fortunately. She had to take care of 4 boys. By that time she had multiple sclerosis, couldn't walk very well. But she had figured out how she was going to go through this war. She ordered, this was also an advice from a very good friend, one of these huge boxes, they must have been higher, because I remember that thing, full of tea. We must have had kilos and kilos of tea in that box. And when the food went down, 44, 43, 44, my younger brothers went out with a pony cart or bicycles, just with small bags of tea, 100 grams, 200 grams, was equivalent to that amount of potato. So you said, how did she influence? She made it possible that we came through the war. She thought it out. She stayed where she knew the people, and she paid for my studies.
Wow. You know, 100% of people that I've interviewed on the show, their mothers had actually done remarkable things. There may be something to this.
It may be something to it.
So, did your brothers all go into medicine too? Or?
No, one did law. The other was, shall we say, more an economical financial man, served for Philips, and was the one who handled all the customs affairs, so he was. And the last one was the cleverest. He's unfortunately died. He was in insurance industry, and he also was thinking also further, and it was fascinating to talk to him.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you told us about your migration to the United States and your service in the U.S. military. Why did you decide to become a U.S. citizen?
Well, I didn't quite decide to become a U.S. citizen. I decided to go to the United States to study medicine. And as I got into Michigan, my green card, which says that I was a privileged immigrant because I had certain capabilities, the famous green card, it became very clear there were strings attached. And one of the strings was, you have to serve. And then things went very fast. I came back to Holland and I said, okay, then I'm going to serve in Germany. We'll be next door. No, I was in Landsberg and Landshut. And they said, no, sir, we have a system. You go to Arizona. Well, at that particular point, I didn't mind at all. And the more because I was told that, you know anything about Arizona, but that it was a rather empty place, 25th United States Air Force Base. We trained fighter pilots. And I would have a ward of 35 beds. I only had a little experience. So it was marvelous. And in the process of being an officer and a captain, the citizenship came more or less automatic. And then when I was in Boston, I signed up.
Now, how did you decide to go to, so you finished your military service, you felt probably you had developed confidence because you had to take care of things on the base. And why did you choose Boston? What happened there?
Well, one of the problems we had with the fighter pilots, because they were in training, we had quite a bit of cardiac complaints. I think it was stress, flying in these damned airplanes. And so one of the things that was in the library of my internal medicine wing were books on electrocardiography. And I think in a way that sort of precipitated interest. I had to run my own ECG service, and I had never seen an ECG when I was in Holland, because there the professor is up front, and then there's a long row of white shirts of boys, and at the end come the assistant, yeah? And you never saw the electrocardiogram. I taught myself, and then of course it was very clear, Paul Dudley White, Sam Levine, all the names came to me in the literature. Yeah, where else could you go? I mean, I had no attachment to California, I had no attachment to the Midwest. I had some attachment to the East Coast, and it was marvelous.
Was it hard to get a spot? Or
it was very hard to get a spot, because I went to Boston while I was in the service 3 times. Now, maybe I shouldn't say this about the pilots who flew me, but the first time I went with a T-33 and they had to put so many hours, so I flew with my own jet to Boston Airport. And Logan did my interview at the Mass Journal where they didn't want to have me and flew back. The second time we had a more fun. We had a B-26 bomber, and it was just before Christmas, and we needed some drinks and we needed some lobster. So we flew to Boston, loaded up, a few other things, and I had a couple of very good interviews, and I had definitely a spot at BU, Boston City Hospital. And in a way that was very lucky, because the Mass General and the Peter Brigham were already an elitist place. And if you wanted to learn really simple medicine, internal medicine had been my decision, nothing is as good as a ward at Boston City Hospital. And I was on the 5th and the 6th service. And yeah, you lived in the hospital and it came just like it was in the service. And I think these were the most hands-on times that I ever recall having lived. And then as I made my connaissance at the Great Levine and Harold Levine, they said, why don't you come work at the Brigham? And then I worked here at the Brigham, and then Alex Nader said, why don't you become, by this time I had done my internal medicine and my cardiology. He said, why don't you become pediatric cardiology, because it's so important that you know these things, and Alex was a fascinating man. Then Anna Haug, who was my boss, got meningioma, and so I started running the cath lab. And I did that for a couple of years.
And that you had become a pediatric cardiologist already by that time.
Yeah. And I've never regretted, because there was Bob Gross, there was Alex Naders, there were all the things. I remember the problems with the Kennedy's youngest child that was brought in from Martha's Vineyard, and Bobby was saying, doctor, if you kill her during your catheterization, you'll hear from me. All those things.
It sounds a little scary, but at the time, so this was, what years were these that you were?
That was then 53 to, I left Boston in 68.
So cardiopulmonary bypass really became a thing during your tenure.
We didn't even do bypasses yet, but we had the pump. We did hyperbaric surgery, all these wonderful ideas that didn't work out. But we had very competent surgeons already then. And Dwight Harkin, Bob Gross, whom I learned an awful lot from. And it was fascinating to live with these people in this growing community. And Sam Levine, who said, put the guy with the infarct in that chair. I see him there.
It's amazing. So a lot of medical history.
A lot of.
So then in 68, did you go, what changed your course there?
Well, I was by that time associate professor. I had no intention to leaving. I had a good house in Weston, good friends, and you're second generation, but you can still have a lot of promise in the future. I was at that time established investigator for the American Heart. I had my own lab. And then a man appeared in my office and he said, I'm the dean of Rotterdam School of Medicine. We have nothing, but we have the money to build a new faculty and eventually a total university. And he said the famous words, if you think American medicine is so great, come back and show me.
So there was a challenge.
If you're 40 and in the little till there is a couple of million to build a unit, you'd be stupid not to do.
Now, what was your research in Boston? What were your grants studying?
Well, the ECG was still, of course, a very important diagnostic tool. And I had been working with a very good electrophysiologist at the main medical center, who explained to me that it's very funny that we doctors look at the outside of the chest at a couple of million cells and think that we can make logic out of it, when in fact blood is running through that heart all the time and is actually an electrical sink. And we made the observation that if you, for example, in a child with polycythemia, exchanged it for serum, the ECG could get a huge Q wave or it could disappear. And that was really the research I was doing, the influence of the hemodynamic conditions on the electrocardiogram.
So you're really doing physiology, old-fashioned human physiology.
Yeah, it was physiology.
So,
but that was our tool. Don't forget,
yeah.
we could listen, and we had a phonocardiogram, and then there was, of course, the experience of the electrocardiogram all over, and that was it. I remember coming back once to, in the time that it was still Boston City Hospital with, at Thorndike, and Larry Ellis was the boss, and he said, "What have you seen in Europe? Are you doing anything?" I was going home to see my family. And I had in fact seen something. I had seen how Siemens was checking the big pipes from which we built up our gas transport system in Europe. Not anymore with X-ray, because people got really burned, and these guys didn't know how to protect themselves. And they used echo, they used ultrasound. And it was fascinating, and then of course the Swedes did something, so I told Larry, I said, I think if we could use ultrasound on the chest of mankind, it might be the best. You get out of here, this is not the way to talk to words. And I had to do Schillingford's, corner Schillingford curves for the cardiac output, as you know, with cardiogram. Ultimately, I think I have a lot to thank for that period, because when I got to Rotterdam, my first priority was to develop the echo, and it was at the same time that in Indianapolis we worked. So we
built up,
parallel developed, and look at where it is now.
Well, so we don't have time to go through everything. This is amazing, and, but I do have some questions about Rotterdam, because obviously it's an amazing thing that was done there. But it's unusual to start building a heart center or a cardiology faculty instead of a whole school of medicine, and then you develop cardiology. What actually happened there? How did the thorax center develop?
Well, the first thing was that there had never been a real medical school in Rotterdam. And bodies were growing, Leiden couldn't cope, Utrecht was maximally full, and so the government decided we need another medical faculty and then another technical part, etc., and eventually build a new university. That of course was the government point of view. We had a different point of view. We were a group that had come from America, a group that was still in Europe. We were sort of an advanced development group. And with this dean, Querido, who was a fascinating man who thought 20 years ahead, we could bring in certain new concepts. So the second great thing that came my way was that as they were building a totally new complex, they had some test sites where they tested out whether beams could carry so much weight, etc., etc. And this, in 1968, was offered to me as the future thorax center. I only looked at the naked square meters. I saw through it. Others said, "Are you completely out of your mind? This can never become a hospital." But the advantage was that it was empty, and everything had been taken out of it, except maybe the beams, and we could plan on the top floor a center around which we had our intensive care beds, like I had learned from Bernie Lown how important it was, but they were next to the operating room, and that was next to the cath labs. And all of these things we could build from scratch in this skeleton of a building.
What today we call a heart hospital. You built one before anyone else.
Absolutely.
I'm not aware there was another one before that.
No, there wasn't. But I learned all the principles in Boston and elsewhere where this was going on, but there was space. And so I told the architects what I needed, and they were good enough to follow us, with one exception, and I was furious. They said, "We will keep the elevator shaft." I said, "How can you get a patient in here with a respirator, etc.? Oh, they said, "Very easy. You disconnect the respirator, put the patient in there, take him to the third floor, and bring the respirator." That was the real thinking. We built ultimately a big column on the outside of the building for the transport.
That's engineers and doctors, right? An ongoing story. So things developed, and who were your proteges, and who came along behind you to make it all run? Because no one ever does it by themselves.
That's right. Well, I think there were several generations. the first generation were people who had stayed in Holland. They were very reliable, not very imaginative, and while I had very good relations with them, it was clear we had to go beyond. Now, one of the persons that I particularly picked out early was Klaas Bohm. He believed in the echo and the ultrasound signal as I did. He was an engineer. He worked in La Spezia for NATO on the submarine warfare techniques, and I said, you come to Rotterdam. With that, we had the echo thing more or less anchored, because he only saw that. And Jos Holland came out of that. And he's well known in America for the clinical application. The other person that helped greatly were the people who saw the need for an intimate relationship with the surgeons. And so they devoted their cardiac career, cardio training career, to the surgeon. They appreciated it greatly. And then others came in, and we very early on took the computer as an essential tool in the intensive care unit. I got quite a bit of money from Philips. We developed a wonderful system, and I remember one day when management top from Eindhoven came to look at what we had done over those years, and the president said, this is great, but doctor, you should realize it takes us 4 years before we can bring this to the market. We were not interested in the market. But that helped greatly, and the people that came were a younger generation, and they were the new ones, and they thought further. And then we had great help by training good young girls as our nurses. We gave them a full training extra course of a year.
So they became cardiac specialty nurses.
That's right. Defibrillation, you take it works.
Well, back then it was girls were nurses, men were doctors. It's changed a lot now, hasn't it?
But they were good.
So, obviously this was a big success, but you then developed cardialysis, didn't you?
Yeah, cardiologist, I was a bit surprised in a way. Cardiologist stands for a name that means cardiac analysis in one word, but it actually was devoted to multicenter trials, which I know you were doing and many others were doing. And it was obvious to me and to the rest of the staff that we should go beyond the walls of the hospital. I mean, cardiology may be a temporary phase in treatment, but beyond there is a lot to be learned. And I think we learned that we needed to talk to the management of the hospital, that the responsibility of the doctor doesn't stop at the moment the patient leaves the ward. And at that time we had a director who looked reasonably far ahead, and he said, that doesn't belong in my task. You do it elsewhere. Now, that was a great chance. We took a house across the street, and that became 3 houses, and there we set up a separate staff for running trials, some with American friends, some in Europe. And I think cardiology still runs, although the volume has gone down, but you know more about that than I do.
I want to come back to that in a minute as it relates to the other thing that you worked on so much, which was the European Society of Cardiology. How did that happen?
I wish I could give you a simple answer to that. I think what I want to say first is that I give credit to what I learned from the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology, and the force that comes when you bind the profession together. Not limit yourself to only the hospital, or only the town, or only the county, or only the state. And in Europe, I had been around because the meeting that I think is the real onset of the European Society in 1967. No, 76. Prior to that, I looked around, where is the science? Who is practicing? And the countries were different, the languages were different. So I made a long trip. I traveled literally from university to university, find out what they were doing. And that was a great help. I was impressed what was going on, but nobody was reading the German.
It was all isolated from each other.
All isolated, the Italians, the French, it is. So by bringing this together, I thought, and I had learned that really in America, how important it is that the states work together and so forth. I said that we must be able to do the same. And then that first meeting, I think, was a great success because mainly one principle. In addition to talking to the national societies, the French, the Italians, the Germans, the British, and the universities with their vertical structures, I realized that there were many young people who actually, at a level much lower than the establishment, were already talking about catheterization, about defibrillation, about reanimation, etc. And they were the young that were growing in Europe with a considerable delay vis-à-vis America, but they were still growing. And by allowing them to form working groups, which I sold to the national societies as being an innocuous procedure, allowing the young to talk to each other.
Not to disrupt the national societies, of course.
And then I think the tissue became sort of like a weave. Yeah. And the fact that they could grow and talk to the guy there and there was a fantastic thing.
So then, to say it another way, when you arrived back in Europe in '68, there was no European Society of Cardiology.
It was a travelogue with 50 professors who visited each other.
And there was a seminal period in 1976 when things came together. But it took a while for it really to take off in the way it is now, didn't it?
Sure, but then, you know, first we had as one aim the working groups to continue in between the conferences. We had to go from every 4 years to every 2 years to every year. And most importantly, we had always been at the mercy of the hosting country to put out all the effort, which sometimes was a great success and sometimes couldn't be done. So we started our own office. And again, I learned an awful lot from what I'd seen in America at the college, and so forth. And then once that office grew, and Michel and Philip Wilson from Michel Bertrand took that over when the decision was made to go to the Côte d'Azur and have our own heart house, which again had the primeur in America. And that then set up an office in which we got a solid structure, which now is quite well to do.
Fantastic. So let me ask you a couple of key philosophical questions and get your input, and then I want to come back to the personal before we call it quits here. So my understanding of your thinking about cardialysis was you really saw research as an integral part of practice, and you wanted to bring those things together across countries to answer questions that couldn't be answered in a single place. Yet it seems like all of us that have tried to do this so far have not really succeeded. Of course, we're doing a lot of trials, but it's still sort of two enterprises, clinical practice and clinical research. Did we get it wrong, or is it just a matter of
No,
time?
I think I'm glad it still is that way, because what I've learned subsequently, that the best specialists we have are those who have trained in an academic center and then settled in a reasonable large center in, quote, the periphery, which happens to be where most people live. And I think that by having that kind of infusion of scientific interest in the people who are not anymore in the academia, and grouping these together in relevant questions and research for the community, the trial business has been fantastic. Because they kept on thinking, we have to do research, we have to be better, we have to find a better solution, and we're also involved.
So you're cup half full, I'm cup half empty on this, because I see that we could do so much more.
Well, I can see that too, and there are reasons why that must be done and why it's not done, but that is a different story. That is a story how the governments of Europe have not understood the significance of the medical professions, but that's another topic.
Well, but that gets to my second question in a way, which is, you've seen Europe evolve towards a more common union, and you've seen America over these years. What do you see happening in the future in America and Europe as it relates to medical practice and interactions with their governments, which obviously is controlling more and more of what happens in medical practice?
I see two very fundamental problems. The first is we cannot escape a major economic downturn, and with that there will be efforts to take monies away from science, and particularly from medical science. And the second thing that I see is that in the control of the profession, we have to be together. We have to be stronger in the American College, stronger support from the American Heart, stronger in the European Society, better working together in profiling or presenting a profile to the government. They are now trying, both sides of the ocean, to pick off individual groups and demoralizing this fantastic movement that we've had the last 30, 40 years. They don't seem to want to recognize that doctors are decent people. They seem to tell the populace they are enriching themselves, they have a privilege, they are not spreading it around, they are not taking care of your problem, they are part of your problem. We were just before I left for Stockholm, wrote all the specialties from Holland, an open article in the leading journal, and it read more or less like this: "Dear people of Holland, don't listen to what the government is telling you about us. We are not making too much money. We have this, we have an agreement, we have such and such, we have a good system. Maybe please, what would you do if we couldn't remain the pilots in the plane? The pilot gets training, he gets retrained, he has to recertify, and they determine what is very good for the airplane, and you're sitting in the airplane. Please listen to our arguments and don't listen to the government propaganda." And I think that was spot on, because we are slowly, one step after the other, country here, country there. They think, whether it is the tendency to increase bureaucracy, whether we were unwise to show great successes and not solving everybody's problem, maybe we should look at ourselves, that we were too bright, therefore source of envy. But whatever the sum total is, we have to defend ourselves and band together, like when you drove west with a covered wagon, so in the evening, to fight against the Indians. And they are Indians, they're shooting left and right at us. And they take things out of proportion. For example, trivial but painful. They forced us a new system by which you were rewarded per performance, and they had a long list of performance. Well, if you do that, and you don't do your research, you make mistakes such as was made with a leading microbiologist. He was rewarded for each time he looked in a slide, which took him 3 minutes. So he made $1.4 million. And he said to the government, "I want to give back my money," because they said, "Perfect system." And then it gets in the paper, that hospital has a doctor who even makes $1.4 million. And that's kind of, it's pity if it would go. We must work closer together, and I think therefore the nations, and particularly our continents, must be close together. We must inform each other, we must band together, we must maybe sometimes be a bit disobedient.
Yes, okay.
But be individuals.
So if you were a young cardiologist now, let's say a young pediatric cardiologist, coming up through training, what would your advice be to that person?
My first thing would be a question. Do you want to be a doctor? Are you committed? Is that your satisfaction in life? Talking to sick people and doing whatever you can do. If you say yes, then I say fight for it. Get the best training and you'll find a place in the system. And your colleagues will appreciate you, and your patients will appreciate you, and the government bureaucrats will respect you. But you must first begin with that commitment. And what I see today more and more is that people get in there because it was such a nice thing to do, or because you could make some good earnings, etc., etc.
So
We cannot allow that.
It's very useful advice. Well, I thank you very much for giving us the story. I found it fascinating. I'm sure our readership will too.
Okay, I hope so. Because I must say I was very privileged to see all of this and to experience all of this. There's a good saying, huh? You have to be at the right place at the right time with the right feeling.
That's
and
right.
do it.
I can assure you, having a daughter with congenital heart disease, she would not be alive today if not for people like you. And now she's 30 years old with a beautiful granddaughter and doing well after major surgery. So thank you very much.
Well, hope to see you soon.
You bet.
Come back to Europe. We'll not quite disappear yet, and we still have great friendship to America. And let's not forget, I would think a quarter, if not a third, of the current generation cardiologists in all of Europe has major ties to America, if not training there, then respect for the meetings, etc. And we are one community, and we are not just trying to, shall we say, conquer the world, forgetting about America.
Well, I appreciate that. And I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I found it enjoyable and fascinating. If we go back to 1928, things were different. A lot has happened, but we still have a lot of the same human issues to deal with.